Today my guest is Jeremy Likness. Jeremy, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great.
What do you do?
What do I do?
I know
That's a good question.
I know the answer to this question already, but tell us.
I do quite a bit. So I'm a project manager and a consultant with a company called Wintellect, and so that involves writing code, managing projects, mostly in the Silverlight space.
Huh?
Plenty of Windows Phone. We've been doing a lot of Slate recently. And then I do a lot of blogging, a lot of talking, a lot of evangelizing.
You're doing a lot of
Silverlight,
stuff.
and also a couple open source projects.
Let's talk about that. Let's
Okay.
talk about the database you're building, the Silverlight database.
Sure.
Complete my thought for me.
Okay, so the database is called Sterling, and it's Silverlight based. It actually started before the Windows Phone was in the picture. And we saw a need. We were building a lot of out-of-browser offline apps, and there was no good solution for storing data locally.
Okay.
So it came about with that need, but what was nice was when the phone did release, because it runs Silverlight framework, pretty much the same code base, it was just a couple hours to really link the project into a Windows Phone 7 and make it available for the phone.
Okay.
And
So you're talking about offline databases. So Silverlight and the phone, they're connected to the internet. You can access data somewhere out in the cloud.
Right,
server
exactly.
somewhere. But that's not guaranteed. Connections can be unreliable.
right.
And you still want your app to work during those times.
Right, yeah, you want to, so there's really two cases that it's common. The first is the occasionally disconnected, right? And a great example when we're doing just Silverlight, not phone, it's the field agent who goes out, collects information in the field, then they get online and want to synchronize that information. The other scenario though is caching, right? So if you have a large amount of data and you're on the phone, sometimes you don't want as much network traffic or dependency, so you want to store some things locally so you can get them in front of the user more quickly.
Okay. So Sterling solves both those problems. It's a
Yes.
local database, and it's significant because Windows Phone 7, the release is out now, doesn't really ship with the local database.
Correct.
You can use XML to store things, but that's
Right,
It's a lot of code.
you can write your own to
Very good way
isolated
to-
storage, but there's no first-class database that actually allows you to key and index and do all of those features.
okay. Well, describe the features of your database.
So
Sterling.
Sterling is primarily an object-oriented database, and so what that means is there's not a mapping to columns.
Okay.
In other words, you can have an object that references another object that goes 15 levels deep, and you can give it to Sterling, and Sterling will save it. So that's one of the features is that we call it non-intrusive. Whatever classes you design for your application, you don't have to change them to be able to save them and
Okay.
bring them back. So that's one thing, but the second thing is Sterling allows you to define on the fly a key and or indexes that it keeps in memory to reference it. And the best example I can give is if you have a contact database. So you have thousands of contacts, but really you want to search on them by name.
Okay.
It's very inefficient if you're searching to pull that from isolated storage, because isolated storage is slow.
Right.
So what Sterling will do is it'll keep that in memory,
Ah.
do a link to object query, which is lightning fast, and then when you get something interesting that you want to deal with, then it will deserialize it.
Okay, that's interesting. So you have to know in advance what are those keys that you're going to query on.
Correct.
And it'll save those. It'll sort of cache those in memory
Absolutely.
to get to the cache data on the memory of the phone.
Right,
So-
and that's actually an interesting thing when you compare Sterling to other databases is you have to know ahead of time what you want to optimize for, and then it does it really well.
Is that always what I'm using? Link to objects? Is that always how I access this database?
Yes.
Okay. That's a little bit different paradigm than, well, I shouldn't say that. It's generally when I'm thinking of database, I'm thinking of relational database. Just
Right.
because that's the world I'm coming from.
Sure.
And this is not relational. This is an object database where I'm storing kind of everything as a blob.
Correct.
Which I'm hedging on this because I'm getting away from that now. I'm using a lot of ORMs, a lot of object relational mappers. So I'm starting to think of my data the same way that I think of the objects in memory. And you're saying with your database, I don't need that mapping.
Correct.
Because there is no difference.
Right. Yeah, that's
a
a very good difference. Is I'm not mapping to anything. We're saving the class outright.
So that's faster then, right? Or is it?
It can be faster. I think the main advantages that we focus on is it allows the database itself to be extremely lightweight.
Okay.
So for example, the DLL you include is less than 100 kilobytes, so it's not going to fatten your ZAP file. But the other advantage is you can design your classes the way they need to be designed for the application. You don't have to compromise design because you know it's got to be persisted. and you're thinking, well, this table relates to this, so I kind of have to design my classes to make it easy to shuffle
Okay.
data
Yeah,
in and
the
out.
ORM should take care of that, but you're right, it's natively built into it.
Right, well, and a good example is one thing ORMs are now getting better at, but it's what we call the cycle condition, right? So you have a parent that references a child that references a parent. A lot of times that's very difficult to work with, and you get recursion and things like
Sure.
that. And that's one thing with Sterling, it just handles it out of the box. It keeps track of all those references, and when it finds a duplicate one, it just saves the pointer. When you pull it back in, it just recreates that pointer, and you've got your parent and children.
Oh, okay, so you never had this issue with recursively kind of loading things forever.
Right.
Is there a limit as to how much I could store?
Oh yeah,
Store?
absolutely. So you've got two limitations. The first is that isolated storage is slow. And so if you have a lot of records you need to prepare up front and insert, then it's going to take some time to set up your application. So I wouldn't recommend it for hundreds of thousands of records up front.
Okay.
And I say up front because there are applications like Runkeeper's one that I use myself that you go running and it's storing all the GPS locations.
Okay.
And then it uploads it to a server, but it's designed because you're usually running out of cellular reception,
Yeah,
etc. And so it can store a large amount because each insert isn't expensive. It's just if I had to suddenly insert 100,000 at once. The other thing to keep in mind is because the keys and indexes are stored in memory, it's not going to be practical for a million record database. I would argue that you probably shouldn't have a million record database on the phone anyway, but it's not going to scale to that level because you do have that in memory piece.
Okay. What else can you tell us about it?
I mean, again, we've kept very closely to the goals of lightweight and flexible. Side effect of the API that I found that I hadn't even thought of is we actually ended up coming out with a server version, so you can run it in the .NET framework, a Silverlight, and a phone, and that keeps the API consistent, right? So if you know how to fetch and load and save and do all of those, it's the exact same API wherever
Wait,
you are.
let me back up here. So you have a version that's a non-Silverlight version?
I do now,
Okay.
and I was surprised because I figured that problem's been solved on the server, but a lot of people came back and said, A, we want something that has a consistent API so it looks the same on the server, and B, we want something lightweight. We've got a small set of data we want to store. We don't want the overhead of dragging like a SQL Express install into the picture.
Okay.
So let's just get something really low and lightweight that we just point to a file directory and we can persist.
Okay. Is that what the installation is just pointing to a file directory?
Yeah, literally.
Like
You reference the DLL and you create a driver and you say, driver, I want you to store at this directory position, and it's off to the races.
Is this a commercial product you're selling?
No, it's completely open source, and it's also got a very liberal license that allows you to pull down the source and modify it as you see fit.
From where?
From Coplex, sterling.coplex.com.
Excellent. Anything else we'll add?
Sure. So, one thing that I thought was really funny is at Mix, of course, they announced that the SQL CE database was coming out with the Mango release.
Oh, okay, so what I said earlier, that there isn't any real good storage on the phone today, won't be true in Mango.
Yeah, it's coming in. It was
So how does
kind
that
of
affect
funny.
you? Is Sterling still relevant then?
It is, and I had a lot of people come up to me at Mix, and they were kind of like, Jeremy, I know you've been working on Sterling, man, I'm so sorry. And I said, it's not really the same thing. And when I set out for Sterling, I said, something like SQL is not going to be taken on headfirst by a small, like 1, 2, 3-person team, right? We had very focused goals. So the idea is there are a lot of things that SQL CE does well. First thing is it doesn't use isolated storage. It goes directly to the file system, which is layered. Isolated storage is layered on top of that, but it allows it to be a lot quicker for a lot of things.
Okay.
And so there is a head-to-head comparison, but the difference is one of the main uses people use Sterling for on the phone is Tombstone. And so that's where basically you're switching out of an application to another application. There's a process where your application might get killed. So if you want to have a consistent user experience, you need to save all your state, and then when you come back and your application swaps in, you need to pull that state back.
Okay.
Now with Mango, that's lessened. There's something called fast application switching, where most of the time you should still be in memory. But tombstoning can happen, especially if you have a lot of apps running. And so with a SQL CE database, what you'd have to do is come up with some very structured set of data columns, right? Value A, B, and C to save and pull it out. With Sterling, one of the examples I show, you literally have a class that has a type on it, which is going to be the type of my view model that I use for the state of a controller or page. And then I have a dictionary of string and object. So string is the name of what I'm storing, and object can be anything. And with SQL C, you can't do that. You have to know ahead of time what your columns are. With Sterling, I can stuff in a GUID, a datetime, another subclass. And I can take all of those things, put it in this object, and just save it and bring it back. So it makes it very easy to save state
Sure.
and perform Tombstone.
Okay. So it's on Codeplex,
It's on Coplex.
and you are available online where?
Actually, all my information is linked off of Codeplex, but I
Okay.
do have a blog that's c#image.jeremylikness.com. So that's a mouthful. My Twitter is also Jeremy Likness. So as long as you can spell my name, then you can get to my blog and my Twitter, but it's Likness for the last name. But those are the two best places. Twitter links to my blog and all my projects, and I follow Silverlight very closely on both of those as well.
Excellent. Jeremy, thanks a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for interviewing me here at DevLink, which is a conference focused on connections, right? So we can learn a lot about technology and meet new friends.